Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the New Liberal Podcast, part of the Center for New Liberalism. I'm your host, Jeremiah Johnson, and in this episode, we are doing another books episode. I will be reviewing the best books that I read in 2024, talking about what made them so good and why you should potentially read them. We do these episodes in two parts. I read a little bit too much to fit every book into a single episode. So there is a part one to this episode. We will link that in the show notes. That came out in either June or July of 2024. We did part one covering the first half of the year. And this episode here in January 2025 is covering the second half of the year and my overall favorite books of the year. With that said, let's jump into it. All right, so the way we normally structure these episodes is that at the very beginning, I talk about the books that I was somewhat less impressed by, that just didn't capture me quite as well. And so we're going to start with just a small handful of books that just, I didn't love entirely. I didn't have very many books that I hated this year, but there were some that just didn't capture me. Then we're going to go into some of the ones I thought were better than that, some of the good books. We're going to take a little interlude away from the nonfiction that I normally read, the academic stuff, the stuff about politics and history. And we'll take an interlude to deal with fiction. Some of that's just literary fiction, some of it's science fiction, fantasy, that kind of stuff. And then after that interlude, we will get to the very best books that I read in the entire year. I have a top 4 for you this year. I thought they were all really, really strong. So let's start out with some of the books that I was more disappointed by this year. One of the things that I am trying to do more of as I, get older, I am trying to make peace with just not finishing every book that I start. If I start reading a book and it just doesn't grab me and I'm having trouble getting through it, I'm always like, getting bored. I am putting it down and going to do other things. And then I don't come back to it for like 2-3 days. Then I read 5 pages and I get bored again. I've tried to kind of recognize that and not force myself to read the book all the way through. There's a limited amount of time you got in this life, and you should spend it reading books that you actually like rather than books that you feel like you have to read. I used to have that problem that I forced myself through every book. I always have to finish a book. And I just don't think that's true anymore. I make a good effort to get at least part of the way through, 30% to 40% through every book. But if I'm 30% in and it's just, I don't like it and I'm having trouble reading it and I'm constantly getting distracted and I don't care for it, I'm putting it down. And that's one of the things that happened with this book, which is Emperor of Rome by Mary Beard. I was actually pretty disappointed that I ended up not liking this book that much because I have very much enjoyed previous books by Mary Beard. Mary Beard wrote a book called SPQR about the Roman Empire, and I enjoyed that one very much years ago. I thought that was a really wonderful book, and I had no problem reading that. So I saw that Mary Beard had a new book out, Emperor of Rome. It's about the kind of the daily life kind of what it's like to be an aristocrat in Rome, to what it's like to be an emperor. What would they have eaten? How would they have structured their days? What kind of clothing would they have worn? Where did they live? What kind of parties did they throw? What kind of political meetings did they have? All that kind of stuff, from the exciting to the very mundane. And I thought, yeah, that sounds interesting. But for some reason, I just couldn't get into it. I kept putting it down. I kept getting distracted. It just didn't draw me in the way that a good book often draws you in. It didn't hold my interest. And so unfortunately, this is one I just kind of decided to abandon partway through. I just couldn't get through it. So unfortunately, something that I just didn't enjoy very much. Emperor of Rome by Mary Beard. Another book that fell in this category is The Center Must Hold by Yair Zevan. I didn't love this book. I didn't outright hate this book. In fact, many of the things that are in the book I would agree with, but it was one of those things where it's a kind of compilation of essays. There's an essay in the book from Yair Zavan. There's essays from many different people. There's Michael Bloomberg, Tony Blair, as some of the big names, Jennifer Rubin, Yair Lapid. Um, so there's kind of many different essays in here. And I just found many of them are like hit or miss. Some of them were good. Some of them were like a little bit cringe inducing to me, but where I thought they were not very good. And so the book is good and not good in parts, just as a collection of essays. And the overall philosophy of the book, which is that centrism is the answer to extremism and polarization. It's one of those things where I kind of agree. Yair and I would probably agree on many different policy prescriptions, but I kind of take issue with like calling it centrism. I don't like to call myself a centrist. And Yair has an interesting kind of perspective about why centrism itself is valuable. I had him on the podcast to talk about this, and he presented his arguments. I can't say that he fully swayed me. A lot of the things that he describes as centrism, I just think are liberalism. It's an actual political philosophy that goes back hundreds of years and has real political, philosophical grounding in it. And he calls it centrism. And I kind of I've gotten hung up a little bit on the naming convention. His choice to go with the name of centrism, I just not a huge fan of. And so this book was hit or miss for me in that, in virtually any political coalition in any country, Yair and I would probably be in the same coalition in the same party, agreeing on many of the same ideas, having many of the same core principles. And yet I didn't love the way that it was framed. And the book's essays themselves are just hit or miss depending on who's writing it. So this is another one where I didn't hate it outright, but it was not one that I loved. The Center Must Hold by Yair Zavan. The third book that I will include in this category quickly, and then we will move on to some of the stuff that I actually did like, is Shavis Korak's Deals with the Dead. This is a piece of kind of fiction, and this is a fantasy novel from K.J. Parker. This is a book about a guy named Shavis Korak, who is basically a battlefield salvage expert in this fantasy world where, fantasy armies of knights and guys with swords and spears, go fight each other from different fictional nations, right? There ends up being a lot of battlefields with a lot of people dead on them afterwards. And there's stuff you can pick up. You can go pick up all their spears and their swords and their armor and their boots and their, whatever else, right? There's a lot of things that are actually valuable. And so he's a battlefield salvage guy. The novel deals with him and the trouble that he gets into as a battlefield salvager. I just didn't love the pacing of it and the story. It was a little bit too cute. It was one of those novels where it seems like there's twists and turns just for the sake of there being a dramatic twist. And the main character has an implausible ability to kind of pull a rabbit out of a hat, so to speak, to get out of a situation. And not in a way where you're like, oh, that was really cool, but in a way where you're like, oh, so he's just fine now. Like the problem that you were talking about just ends up not being a problem. And so I just didn't love this one. It's the first part in a trilogy, I think. And I kind of elected not to keep reading the trilogy. So maybe if you love fantasy and you just inhale anything, I've enjoyed K.J. Parker novels before, but this one didn't charm me the way that some of the others have. So this one was Shavis Korak's Deals with the Dead by K.J. Parker. All right, so enough of that. Enough of bad or mediocre novels. Let's get into some of the works that I really did enjoy this year. And I'm going to start with a book that, again, we featured on the podcast. We featured a number of these on the podcast. This one is from Brody Mullins and Luke Mullins, and it's called The Wolves of K Street. The Wolves of K Street is a book about how lobbying in Washington, D.C. developed as an industry. The subtitle here is The Wolves of K Street, The Secret History of How Big Money Took Over Big Government. And I think it's a really interesting tale in that it really gets into specific personalities who really, really developed the lobbying industry. Lobbying used to be a very kind of sleepy industry, to be honest. Decades ago, lobbying was not really well respected, and maybe it's not well respected now either, but it was not well respected. It was not well paid. It was not a big industry. There were lobbyists, sure, kind of, but they didn't have a lot of influence and they didn't have a lot of power. They weren't notable personalities necessarily in the same way that they are today. And today, the lobbying establishment is really this like multi-billion-dollar industry that really does have a huge impact on our national politics. And the Wolves of K Street being a street in Washington, D.C. that is infamous for kind of, having had a lot of lobbying firms on it. I don't even know whether that's true anymore, whether they're still located there anymore, but like K Street is synonymous with like the way that Wall Street is the financial industry in New York and America. Wall Street, K Street is like the lobbying industry, right? But it's a really good on the ground look in terms of like it really goes through specific people's personal histories and how these specific people mattered and how they helped build some of the biggest lobbying operations and what specific bills and what specific legislative fights and executive actions they impacted, and how it made corporate America realize, oh man, we've got to start looking into this more. We got to put our money into this. And it's more than just kind of a broad political overview, which would have been fine on its own, but it's a really, really like on the ground personal reporting about specific characters, specific personalities. And some of these personalities in the lobbying industry, some of the guys involved who like helped build this industry, I think it helps that they are kind of very strong, very wild personalities, almost like very, very interesting people. So that I think kind of pushes the book over the edge into being quite a good book. If you're interested in the history of lobbying and if you're interested in the machinery of how the sausage gets made in Washington, D.C., then I think this would be a fantastic book for you to pick up. It's The Wolves of K Street by Brody Mullins and Luke Mullins. So let's just keep the theme going and let's do a second book that I've had featured on the podcast this year, and that is On the Edge by Nate Silver. This book was practically written for me, like me personally. I was the individual audience of this book. And I think I joked with Nate about this, and that On the Edge is by Nate Silver, and he's known for political prognostications. He's known for predictions about presidential elections, first and foremost. He also does predictions for all sorts of other things, for the Senate and the Congress, for other kinds of elections, and for sports events. But regardless of him being known for the political angle, he got his start in something completely different. He got his start as a baseball sabermetrician, that he was kind of producing advanced analytics, trying to predict baseball outcomes. And he was very much into the gambling world. I know that he's dabbled in sports gambling. I know that he's a former professional poker player, and still sometime poker player now. And he, in general, likes to think about quantifying things. He likes things that seem mysterious. political elections and sports events and things like that. And can we actually make those more understandable? Can we quantify them with numbers and make concrete predictions about them? And On the Edge is a book about risk and gambling and the concept of how we manage to put numerical predictions on things and how we manage risk. I think risk is one of the big words that goes all the way through the book. Now, this was aimed at me specifically because I also have a background in poker. I was a semi-professional poker player. I do not think I'm as good a player as Nate Silver, but back in the days when internet poker was a big thing with Full Tilt and Poker Stars and Party Poker, I was able to make some money playing poker. I have also dabbled in sports gambling, and I love that kind of thing. I have a degree in statistics. I love making models and making predictions and, running regressions. But I'm also a politics nerd in the same way that Nate is now. And so a book about how to quantify this stuff is like so directly up my alley. The book contains chapters on the things you think it would contain chapters on. It contains chapters on poker, on, sports gambling, on stuff like that. But it also has chapters on other interesting kinds of risk. It has chapters on things like venture capital, it talks about finance. It talks about the cryptocurrency and the people who are trading meme coins, Pepe coins or whatever nonsense like that. It generally is a interesting examination of why people take risks in order to make money for the most part, and what comes of that. I guess what is the correct way to take risk. It has chapters. Some of the most interesting stuff is actual interviews that Nate got to do with Sam Bankman-Fried, who was the CEO and creator of FTX, which dramatically collapsed. And Nate, almost by chance, by dumb luck, almost. Nate is a talented guy, but I think he would agree that almost he got very lucky to get an interview with Sam as he was still in the Bahamas, kind of on lockdown, like a week before he got arrested or something. He got the most fortuitously timed interview with Sam that I've ever seen. And so we get some insight into, what was going on there. This talks about, the catastrophic risks from AI and how do we think about, is there a chance that AI could end the world? And if you want to think about risk in that way, like how do you actually conceptualize that? The book itself is, I think, really, really interesting. I think Nate is really, really insightful and breaks all this down in a useful way. And so I would heavily recommend On the Edge to anybody who's interested in it. This is one that almost made my top 4. Really, really almost made my top 4. Perhaps the only reason it didn't is because, a lot of the sections on stuff like poker and the gambling stuff was stuff that I was already really familiar with, so I didn't need to really read that part. But for anybody else, I definitely heavily recommend On the Edge by Nate Silver. The next book I want to talk about is a book called Like, Comment, Subscribe by Mark Bergen. Now, first of all, if you're listening to this podcast, we also appreciate if you give any likes on the platform that you're on, if you comment, if you subscribe. All of that is deeply appreciated. Thank you for listening to the New Liberal Podcast, et cetera, et cetera. But this is also something, that particular phrase is something that you may be familiar with from YouTube videos in specific. If you've watched a number of YouTube videos, if you've existed on that platform ever, I feel pretty confident in saying you've heard the phrase, "Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Thanks for watching this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Okay, let's jump into the video." That kind of thing. And that is the focus of this book. Mark Bergen's book, Like, Comment, Subscribe. The subtitle is Inside YouTube's Chaotic Rise to World Domination. This is a book about the history of YouTube, and it documents how YouTube went from an idea to a scrappy little startup to a really, really successful startup to an octopus with its tentacles all over the internet, this giant of the internet. YouTube is one of the single most important and successful websites anywhere in the world of any kind. You can make an argument that YouTube is the most important website in the world. And this book is about how they got there. I thought the book was really well reported and really interesting, and it taught me a lot of things that I didn't know, especially the parts about YouTube's early days. And I'll include the early days as both, when the founders were still there. The founders of YouTube, by and large, are not at YouTube anymore. They've basically all left. And they left at different points in time. But when the founders were still there, how they thought of YouTube, like some of the early struggles of YouTube just to survive, just to keep things going, both on a technical level, how do we technically survive with all this video bandwidth that we need, and with as much data as we're burning through, and the infrastructure that we need. All that's interesting. How do we survive legally? Because, oh my gosh, people are uploading clips of television shows, and now we're going to get this massive lawsuit from, different entertainment studios and television studios and movie studios and music recording copyright holders. We're going to get sued from a million different angles because anybody can upload anything to YouTube. And so how are we going to survive this legally? And it just, how are we going to get people to use the platform? How are we going to convince people, hey, this is not a crazy idea? The idea that you can upload something and actually do that as a living, that your job is to make videos on the internet. From the perspective of today, from 2025, that sounds like the most natural thing in the world. We all know that you can make a living on YouTube. Right now, there are about 500,000 YouTube channels that have 100,000 subscribers. And 100,000 subscribers is maybe a good, kind of baseline for it. On YouTube, if you have 100,000 subscribers, you can probably make that your main living. You can probably make that your main source of income. It depends on how many videos you're putting out and what kind of channel you are and what topics you cover and blah, blah, blah. But 100,000 subscribers is a good benchmark. There are 500,000 channels. 500,000 people have hit that benchmark on YouTube where they could potentially be doing this full time as a job. And so from our perspective, that seems so natural to say, yeah, making content for the internet is a full-time job. That was not always the case, guys. It used to be considered what is this YouTube thing? What are you talking about? And nobody even had the idea that oh, this is a job that I can do full time. This is a thing. This is a career, is to make videos for the internet. How did they convince people to do that? And how did that industry of YouTubers and content creators grow along with the site? All of that is documented in the book. And it's well written. This is one that I did not have any issues with I got bored with it halfway through. No. This one, it's a longer book, but I read it all the way through. I got through it pretty fast. I enjoyed this quite a lot. So if you are interested in the history of YouTube, if you're interested in kind of internet history and how things developed to where they are now, this is something I would definitely recommend. It's Like, Comment, Subscribe by Mark Bergen. All right, so let's take a little bit of an interlude here. We've been talking about kind of more serious nonfiction books that talk about history or specific industries or ideas or politics, and those are all fine. We're going to get back to that. But let's take an interlude to talk about some of the fiction that I've read this year. I've got 5 books here for you. We'll move through them pretty quickly. The first one, again, is a book that I didn't enjoy very much. This was kind of enjoyed it, kind of did not. It could have gone in that first section with stuff I didn't love that much. It's How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe. This is a book by Charles Yu. And to me, just, I don't know, the book couldn't decide what it wanted to be. or maybe it knew what it wanted to be and I just didn't like what it chose to be. I didn't like the direction that it chose to go in. Um, it certainly it's the kind of book that I think got several awards when it came out. It came out in 2010. It was considered like, ooh, this is like thought provoking and, cool and different. And it is different. It's structured very strangely. It's about it's about a character. The main character is some kind of time traveling character, and he goes through and like stops people from trying to change the past. He's like a time traveling mechanic who goes through time and like stops people from building their own time machines or something like that. And the concept is kind of interesting, but it kind of very quickly devolves into, oh, we drop that a little bit and we spend the majority of the novel talking about his father-son relationship with a father who's very absent. It's just this guy grew up with a very absent father, and we spend the majority of the time now talking about like, oh, I'm remembering this episode me and my dad had. I'm wondering why my dad didn't love me. I'm searching for my dad through space-time because I need approval and his love, and I never got it as a child. And like, it just very quickly turns into that and like kind of abandons the science fiction premise a little bit. And the science fiction is almost window dressing for like this novel of like, I need daddy's approval and love. And like, maybe that's what you want. Maybe if I had been in a different mindset, I would have enjoyed this more, but it felt like a hard right turn. It felt like, like it was going in one direction and then very abruptly veered into another direction. And it wasn't ready for it. I wasn't in the space to appreciate that. So maybe a lot of people would appreciate that, but I was not entirely enthralled by it. But it's something I read this year. I did get all the way through it. So that's the book, How to Live Safely in a Science Fictional Universe by Charles Yu. The next book that I read this year is called The Memo by Rachel Dodds and Lauren Meckling. This is not The Memo by a different author. There's another book called The Memo. I think it's by Minda Harts. That memo is subtitled "What Women of Color Need to Know to Secure a Seat at the Table." I'm sure that's a fine book. I did not read it. This book, The Memo, is got a very kind of a charming, interesting premise. You know that phrase that people say where people are like, it feels like you've missed out on something and like, oh, well, did you not get the memo? Oh, you missed out. Did you not get the memo? You ever feel like everybody else's life has been, flying by with success and they've been doing amazing things and you've been stuck in neutral doing nothing and you feel like literally, oh, I might have missed the memo. That's the premise of this book. The main character is a woman named Jenny Green, and she is going to her upcoming college reunion, and she used to be like top of her class and blah, blah, blah. But now she's 35, and she finds that she's stuck in a life that she doesn't want. Or at least it's not the one she expected. She's not super satisfied, and she looks at all her college classmates, and they're doing amazing things. They're groundbreaking artists or like scientists or executives or whatever the case may be. They're all very successful. And she wonders to herself, well, did they just all get a memo and I didn't? And it turns out that yes, there literally was a memo. And in this world, at this college, there's some secretive group or something that sends a memo to every graduating woman. And each woman gets the memo that tells them how to succeed in life. And she just she didn't get her memo. Like it got lost in the mail or something like that. And so at her college reunion, 10 years later or whatever, she finally gets the memo and she realizes, oh no, there's a literal memo that I missed. That is the reason that my life is not going the way I wanted it to. And she gets a chance to kind of take the advice of the memo a second time. She gets a second chance. I just thought the premise of this was really interesting Like, you take one of those common phrases and, like, let's take that seriously. Let's take that literally and explore what would that actually mean if you had missed the memo. It's also just quite well written. I enjoyed the characters. The characters are well rounded and conceptualized. The pace of the writing I thought was pretty snappy. The interior life of the characters is good. And so I would recommend this book. I'm not going to say too much more about what happens in the book because you don't want to spoil it. But I thought the memo was kind of a fun, breezy little read, and would recommend it. So that book is The Memo by Rachel Dodds and Lauren Meckling. All right. Another book that I read this year in the fiction category was Babel by R.F. Kuang. Now, I have previously enjoyed a book by R.F. Kuang called Yellowface. I thought that was really, really interesting and provocative. I think I read that last year. And so I picked up another book by R.F. Kuang thinking, if one was good, maybe the other will be as well. And Babel was a very interesting book to me. So Babel is about a student who was orphaned in India. I'm sorry. They were orphaned in Hong Kong, I believe, in the 1800s, and they're brought to London by a mysterious professor. This is a young boy named Robin who seems to be unnaturally talented at language and translation. And, he reads English and Latin and Greek and several dialects of Chinese. And he's going to enter the prestigious Oxford University Translation Institute. And basically, there's a system of magic in this book. It is a little bit grounded in the real world. It's grounded in like 1800s Earth. But in this version of 1800s Earth, there's magic, and the act of translation can also inspire a form of like power. It is kind of an arcane craft, is one of the words or one of the phrases that I've seen to describe it, where like, there's always different meanings of words. Like one language's word for happiness and another language's word for happiness might have different inflections. They might have different slight meanings. One of them is more like the happiness that you feel exterior, and one of them has more kind of the intention of being like the happiness that you show to other people. And so they might look at that translation and say, okay, the gap is interior versus exterior. And so by translating those two words on a specific bar of silver, we can make that bar of silver a lie detector test. We can see the interior from the exterior. And it's kind of this interesting way of like both looking at etymology and the differences in translation, which I love. I'm like a nerd for etymology and the history of words and the translations of different things. And then kind of a magical system that turns that into like real power. Anyway, not to get too deep into it, but basically in this world, one of the things that's made the British Empire possible is that the British are the world's foremost experts at translation, and they gather all the most talented translators and linguists from around the world to build up their own ability to kind of work this style of magic, this translation magic, whereby, translating things in a specific way on a specific medium can actually produce real effects in the real world. And so the British have kind of used this translation power to build up the British Empire. And the center of the book is this main character, Robin, takes a journey in terms of, growing in the world, becoming more important, more valued as a piece of this imperial project, but also at the same time kind of becoming more uncomfortable with it the more that he realizes what's going on. And he starts to wonder, am I betraying the place that I come from? Am I actually Chinese? Am I from Hong Kong? Is that my identity, or am I British because I came over here as a very young child? And so a lot of it is him warring with those two concepts, deciding what kind of path he wants to take in life. So I don't know. Very interesting overall. It's very well written. I think R.F. Kuang is a really talented writer. The one negative thing I would say is that towards the end of her books, both Yellowface and Babel, she loses a little bit of the subtlety and starts beating you in the head a little bit with certain ideas. But the writing is good enough that I didn't mind it that much. So I will recommend, if you enjoy fantasy, especially like historically grounded fantasy, Babel is a very interesting book by R.F. Kuang. Two more fiction books to go before we get to my top 4 of the year. The first one that I'll cover of the last two is a book called The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. Now, I'm going to be entirely honest with you and say that I picked this up just because it had a cool title. And it's the first of a trilogy, and all of the trilogies, that every entry in this trilogy has a cool title. Like, I think The Blade Itself is just a cool name for a book. The second book in the series is Before They Are Hanged, which again, just seems like a cool title for a book. It's one of those ones where, I recognize the author's name and the title's really cool, and I'm like, yeah, I'll give that a try. Sometimes life is simple. But I did end up enjoying this book. The Blade itself is a pretty standard fantasy book. It sets a universe with wizards and, barbarians and a court. There's a king and a court and a castle and yada, 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 all that kind of stuff. It does have some really interesting characters, though. Like, one of the main characters is a crippled torturer. It's the guy who is basically the leader of the Inquisition. Like, if you imagine the Spanish Inquisition, he leads this fictional fantasy nation's Inquisition, and he is the head torturer, and he tortures people to get their secrets. And that sounds like it sounds like difficult. Like, how would you actually build a interesting character out of that? But the thing is, he's not actually very powerful. He's not like this calculating, evil, cackling guy. He's actually crippled from having been tortured himself and like having had all his bones broken at some point. And I don't know, it's hard to explain. I may sound like a crazy person saying that this character is actually super interesting, but the book is just, yeah, it builds up some interesting characters who are not the typical thing that you would think. It has an interesting world building kind of thing, and I was left wanting more. I read the book and I was like, wait, the story's not finished because it's part 1 of a trilogy. So I immediately ordered the second one. That's one of the books I'm looking forward to reading in 2025 here. So won't tell you too much of the plot to give anything away, but the book is The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. And then the final piece of fiction that I will recommend for you this year, this is one that falls into the category of web serials. I usually, in these books episodes, have 1 or 2 pieces of web fiction that I recommend every year. These are books that are not things you buy from Amazon necessarily. They're things you can just read online. They're published online, often in blog format, sometimes in a more non-traditional format. And they are just stories that you can read online for free. And regardless of that, there's a lot of good stuff out there. So this one is titled, There Is No Anti-Memetics Division. Now, if you know the meaning of the word meme, a meme can mean like an internet joke, right? Or a template for a joke. But the original meaning of meme actually goes back to the scientist Richard Dawkins. And yes, that Richard Dawkins, the guy who's famous for being an atheist, he coined the biological meaning of meme, which was originally to do with genetics. A meme was just a piece of a gene that replicated itself over and over. And eventually it came to mean any kind of piece of information that is self-replicating, an idea that makes you want to tell it to other people, and therefore the idea replicates itself in the same way a virus would. And so the original meaning of meme was very much like, in the sense of ideas can be viruses, just like biological things can be viruses. And modeling ideas as viruses is very interesting. And so that's what a meme is. But what would that make an anti-meme? An anti-meme in this story is an idea that by its nature is difficult to spread, that people see the idea and don't want to spread it, or they see something and instantly forget it. There is no anti-memetics division is about the anti-memetics division. And the anti-memetics division has to deal with, is a part of this fictional organization called the Foundation. And the Foundation deals with anomalous threats to Earth, kind of science fiction threats to Earth. They deal with weird entities like X-Files kind of stuff. And the Foundation exists to protect us from that kind of thing. If some weird thing comes from outer space or some weird old, god wakes up, they're the ones who deal with it. The Foundation takes care of it. And the anti-memetics division deals with things that people can't remember. The very first chapter of the book involves the chief of the anti-memetics division going into the kind of the CEO of the Foundation. And he says, I've never seen you before. She says, I'm your chief of anti-memetics. And he says, we don't have an anti-memetics division. And it's because he can't remember, because the very idea that you have to fight anti-memes is an anti-meme. Like, it's one of those crazy things where, like, how do you fight an enemy that every time you see it, it makes you forget that it exists? So a very kind of bizarre, but really, really interesting premise. I think that it's a fantastic story. It's a really, really gripping story. If you like that kind of like really unusual premise for a science fiction universe that really leans into kind of eldritch horror in a way, like how do you fight something you can't see or remember? How do you even remember that you're supposed to fight it when 24 hours later, it's exited your mind? And how do you build an army when you can't tell people about something? That kind of stuff is really, really interesting to me. I thought this was really fantastic. So I would highly recommend There Is No Anti-Memetics Division as a great piece of web fiction. Now I think we will get into our top 4. These are the top 4 books that I read in the last year. Not all of these are from the last year. Some of them are several years old. Some of them are from actually 2024. But all of them, I thought, were really strong, and they presented new ideas to me that I just, I always appreciate a new idea more than an old idea. I read a lot of books on topics that I already know a lot about. And so, like, at this point, it's very rare for, like, a book on housing to be in my top 4. Just because it's hard for a book on housing to tell me something I don't already know, just because I spend so much time on housing already. These books, by and large, all 4 of them presented new ideas, and I bought into the ideas, and I thought they were thought-provoking and well-written. So let's get to number 4, which is Nuclear War, a Scenario by Annie Jacobsen. This book is basically what it says in the title. It is a scenario for a nuclear war. Now, you may be the kind of person who doesn't worry about nuclear war very much. You may be the kind of person who worries about it all the time. The point of this book is not to say what specific percentage likelihood there is that nuclear war will happen. They're not trying to make a claim that, like, oh, there's a 20% chance we will have a nuclear global annihilation. That's not the point. The point is just to say that there is a scenario in which this happens, and here's what it would look like. Here's what a scenario would look like that ends up with the entire world in nuclear winter, with thousands of nuclear bombs being detonated all over the world. That is a thing that is plausible to happen, and here's what it would look like. Here's the detailed breakdown of how that would come to pass. So in the book, it's just a scenario. It just starts with, okay, for some reason that we can't understand, the North Korean government decides to fire a nuclear weapon. And from there, things break down, and it gets into very, very specific kind of knowledge about, like, okay, in this scenario where we see a mysterious warhead, a missile coming from North Korea, and it seems to be pointing at North America, we have 20 minutes or something like that. It's some very short amount of time before it lands. We have 20 minutes to decide what to do. What happens in those 20 minutes? Who are the people involved? In the military structure, what is happening and who are the decision makers? What information is being relayed from which organization in the military to which other organization? Who's informing the president? How many minutes does it take to get him informed? How long does it take to verify that information, that this is not a, false positive? What are the mitigation strategies? Okay, we see this missile coming from North Korea. What can we do about it? It turns out not much. Theoretically, we might be able to shoot it out of the air, but probably not. It's probably very, very difficult from what we know, best practices, technology, where we are now. It's very, very difficult to shoot down an intercontinental ballistic missile. And we probably would not be able to do it. We could try. There's a non-zero chance we could knock it down, but it goes through all of that. And at the end of it, nuclear weapon explodes in America, in Washington, D.C. And the president and the vice president are either killed or incommunicado. They were not able to get them out of D.C. at the same time. And so, okay, then if in that scenario, what would happen? Who would become the next decision maker? How many minutes would they have to decide whether to retaliate or not? And so it basically just walks through, here's what would happen, here's what a likely response would be, here's what other countries might do, here's what other countries' responses might be. And it kind of walks you through it. It wouldn't take that many unreasonable people to end up in global nuclear war with hundreds to thousands of nuclear bombs being set off all over the world. It would take a handful of unreasonable things happening, but unreasonable things do happen sometimes. And I thought this book was really, really good for both the detail it provides and just the kind of sobering nature of this could actually happen. This is a real thing that could happen. We're not making a claim about exactly how likely it is, but this is not a 0% chance. Do you have 100% confidence, a literal 100% confidence that North Korea, that Kim Jong-un wouldn't just do something insane? Because I don't have that 100% confidence. I don't think it's likely that North Korea would shoot a nuclear weapon at somebody, us or someone else. But, I also don't think it's impossible, given what I know about North Korea. There's a chance they could just do something insane. And, if that happened, would the United States and other nuclear powers overreact? Would they react in dangerous ways? Would they be able to stop it from spiraling? Would they be able to, they might attack North Korea, but what if Russia, as those missiles are flying over the Arctic, what if Russia interprets all those missiles headed to North Korea as attacks on Russia? Would we actually be able to convince them, no, Russia, we're not attacking you, we're just attacking North Korea? Would Russia buy it? Because, Russia doesn't trust us a lot right now. And we don't trust Russia. We don't have the greatest of relations with them. It would not be that implausible that communications would break down and Russia would think we are attacking them with nuclear weapons. And what would happen then? That I found really sobering and really frightening in a way. I think this is a scarier book than anything you will ever read in the horror or thriller genre. This will frighten you more than those things do if you're smart. Some people I know, some people in the military and intelligence communities have they've nitpicked the book is how I would describe it. It got this thing wrong about the structure of command. This guy would report to this other guy, not to this guy. And I think those are valuable nitpicks, but I do think they're nitpicks. The central theme of the book is that in complicated systems like this, things can go wrong. And I think that remains very true. So I don't know. I thought this book was eye-opening and interesting, and I would recommend that you read it if you're interested in this sort of geopolitics and this sort of worst case scenario theorizing. So the book is Nuclear War, A Scenario by Annie Jacobson. All right, something a little bit brighter than that. My number 3 book of the year was Recoding America by Jennifer Palka. And the subtitle here is Recoding America, Why Government is Failing in the Digital Age and How We Can Do Better. Now, I actually had Jennifer on the podcast to talk about this book along, her book along with kind of the Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy DOGE effort. The DOGE being the Department of Governmental Efficiency, which is kind of this unofficial organization that they want to run that will make recommendations about how to run the government more effectively. And Jennifer Palka has a lot of thoughts about that. She may be one of the smartest people working in America today in thinking about how do we actually make the government more effective? How do we actually make them more efficient, effective, and better at what they do? Recoding America's main message is that the ineffectiveness of government, the things that really frustrate us, are mostly not about how much the government spends. Is the government spending too much or too little? The biggest thing we should worry about, I think Palka would argue, is that what we do spend is not effective enough, that we spend these amounts of money and then don't get our money's worth out of it. And I think Palka's argument is that we would not need more money. The question is not that we need more money, and it's not that we even need more technology, because there's a lot of efforts in the government to like re-digitize things or, technological upgrade for this whole branch of the government. That happens all the time, actually. So what is actually crippling the government is not the technology, the computer systems or anything. It is not the amount of money that they get. It is the rigid bureaucratic nonsense that they have to deal with, that there are rules upon rules upon rules upon rules upon rules. And there are just so many regulations and practices and rules and standards that are no longer useful, but that are still followed to the letter, and that slow everything down, that stop anything good from happening. And it's one of those things where any individual rule, you can see, oh, well, I guess I understand why that particular one exists. You can go back to some episode that happened in the 1980s or whatever, and there will have been something that happened and they had to put the rule in place because, we don't want that to happen again. But, for things that have been around for a long time, for, things that have existed since the departments that have existed since the 60s or 70s or whatever, that just means that they've had, 40, 50, 60, 70 years of rulemaking accumulate. And it's the kind of thing where rules never go away. They just keep building and building and building, like a layer of paint on top of another layer of paint on top of another layer of paint. And it turns out if you do that enough time, your whole building just becomes paint. And you have to slice through 70 layers of rules before you can actually get to the thing you care about. Whatever the thing you are trying to do has been crippled by following rules that are decades old, that probably aren't even needed anymore, or that are needed in 0.01% of cases, when you really could just handle those cases as exceptions manually, but instead you slow down every other case, 99.9% of the cases, in order to, implement this rule. And Palka talks about that. She talks about a firsthand experience, how she saw government be crippled in this way in many different organizations. I think it's a fantastic book. If you care about the abundance agenda, if you care about, having a liberalism that builds, if you care about YIMBYism and infrastructure and all these things that we talk about so much on this podcast, Recoding America is one of the best books you will read that will talk about how do you actually fix this, and what does this actually look like in practice and from the inside of a government organization. If you are inside that malfunctioning government organization, it is not that the people on the inside want it to malfunction. It's not that they're lazy. In many cases, they're very hardworking and they really want the government to be doing good things, but they just feel trapped by these rules. And so that is, I don't know, I think it's a wonderful examination of the problem and what that problem looks like from the inside view and why it's happening. So would heavily, heavily recommend this to anybody who is interested in these kind of things that we talk about all the time, the abundance agenda and building. The book is Recoding America by Jennifer Palka. Now, the number 2 book is one that I believe I talked about in the first books episode we did earlier this year. It is The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. And this book I really enjoyed. I think it's got a lot of truth to it. And I think it's on a really important topic. One of the things that I care about a lot is this social media and how social media is impacting our lives and our relationships and our politics. I write about this a lot in my blog at Infinite Scroll. And this book, I think, really hits the nail on the head in terms of some of the dangers that come from allowing kids too much access into social media. I don't think that, we should starve children digitally, technologically. I don't think we should, make sure that they never touch a computer, never see a screen until they're, 18 years old. I think that would be ridiculous. But I think it's equally ridiculous to give them kind of unfettered access to iPhones and iPads and screen time and social media, especially from very, very young ages. I see 4-year-olds walking around with iPads that just, it's pretty clear that all the 4-year-old does is stare at this iPad all day. And I think there are real dangers to that. And there's real negative consequences that can come from that. And Jonathan Haidt's book, I think, is really, really solid. There's a whole fight about, did Jonathan Haidt get his statistics right? Is he manipulating things? Is he doing the data? And so people will go back and forth with part of the problem here is that the data is in points contradictory because there's so much of it. Because you can look at, data from the US and you can say okay, well, which kids are getting how much screen time and how are we measuring that? Are we measuring it by hours in front of a screen, or should we only measure it in terms of hours in front with your smartphone, hours on social media? There's 100 different ways you can measure what is the problem behavior. And then there's also 100 different ways you can measure what is the outcome. Should we measure teen happiness? Should we measure teen life satisfaction? Should we measure how many teens are anxious or depressed? Should we measure how many teens have real world friendships that they see outside of social media? Should we measure teen suicide? Should we measure teen academic achievement? So part of the problem is that you've got 100 different ways to measure the input variable and 100 different ways to measure the output variable. And so you can kind of get whatever story you would like. If you want to tell the story that this is a problem, you can do that. If you want to tell the story that this is not a problem, you can find a combination of variables that will do that. You can also look internationally at all sorts of stuff like this, right? You can say, oh, well, we shouldn't just look at America. Let's look at New Zealand. Let's look at France. Let's look at the UK. Let's look at Sweden. Let's look at blah, 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 all these different countries. So the data is confusing, but I will say, having looked at a pretty large amount of the data, I think that Jonathan Haidt is onto something. I think there's something here where there is a negative effect if you're from screen time at particularly at very young ages. And this is not to be panicky about it. This is not to be a moral crusader. I'm not telling you that you're evil if you put a screen in front of a child, but I'm just saying that, at some level, there's a great phrase I love, the dose makes the poison. Anything can be poisonous in certain volumes, right? Water can be poison. You can die from too much water. You can be water poisoned. I don't know if you knew that. That's a real thing. Look it up. But the dose makes the poison. Some things that are fine in moderation are not fine in excess. Some things that are fine a little bit are not fine when you have a lot of them. And I think social media, especially for young people, fits into that. What is the correct dose of social media for young people? I don't know. We're still figuring that out. This is, social media has barely existed for 10 years, so we're we're in the middle of figuring this out as a society. But I do think that it's real and a problem. The other thing that I'll say about Hate's book, and it gets less attention, but I think it's equally valuable. Hate's book says that, at the same time we are giving kids unfettered access to the social internet, just unlimited access. Go look at the craziest shit on the internet that you want, and we're not even going to monitor it. We are also greatly restricting their real world freedoms. We used to let kids walk a mile to school or 2 miles to school, and we don't do that anymore. I walked to school when I was in, not that long ago. When I was in high school, I graduated in 2005. And I know that makes me ancient for all the Gen Alpha listeners out there. But in 2005, not that long ago, I walked to school. That was not an unusual thing for me to do. Or I would walk home from school, and it was a mile or two. I don't know. But we don't do that anymore. Nobody walks to school. You have to be driven. If you let your kid walk to school, you might get, somebody might call CPS on you, Child Protective Services. There was a survey, and I may get the details of this wrong, but I'm pretty sure I have them right. There was a survey where they asked parents, what age does your child need to be to play in the front yard of your own house by themselves without like a parent standing there next to them? You're inside the house and they're playing in the front yard by themselves. What age does a child need to be? And I think the average age that was given was like 10 or 11 years old, which it seems crazy to me. Before they're 10 years old, they can't go outside to the front yard by themselves. But that's one of the things that is really also, I think, really negatively impacting young people, is that we are restricting their real world freedoms. We're not letting them wander. We're not letting them do things in the real world and discover things and be independent of adults. Children finding a way to be independent and to gain confidence doing things independently, that's really important. And we don't let them do that anymore. We don't let them do anything without adult supervision. Everything is structured and adult supervised now. And so Hate actually worries about that a lot. And I think the point of the book is this one too, that we've, drastically restricted children's freedom and independence in everything that matters in the real world, while giving them unlimited access to social media and the internet, which is just not a great combo. So if you are concerned with kids, with screen time, with this sort of social problem, heavily recommend The Anxious Generation by Jonathan Haidt. And that takes us to the final book of the episode. The best book I read in 2024 was The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory by Tim Alberta. This is a book about the American evangelical movement and how it has contributed to political extremism. This was another one that I think I covered in the first books episode of the year, but it was the best book I read all year. It is a fantastic book. And if you are concerned about extremism, if you are concerned about contemporary Christianity in America, I cannot recommend it heavily enough. This is a fantastic book. One of the reasons that I think it is so effective is that Tim Alberta is not an outsider to this culture. He is not some liberal elite from New York who was born in Manhattan and is a progressive socialist from Brooklyn, doing kind of snobby reporting on the country bumpkins from evangelical land. That is not who he is. Tim Alberta was born in this movement and still very much identifies himself kind of with the movement. His father was an evangelical pastor. He grew up in an evangelical church. All his family relationships and friends have always been in that world. and he found himself growing disillusioned with it. And he didn't abandon it and say, well, I'm not a Christian anymore. Like, he's still very much a Christian, and this is a Christian's critique and a Christian's reporting on how the evangelical Christian movement went so wrong, in his opinion. It talks about all sorts of things. It talks about, the history of televangelists and celebrity revival kind of stuff, and how that cheapened faith to some extent, and how faith became basically just a way to express your politics. Something that I think a lot of evangelical churches have been dealing with in the last 10 years is this infestation of politics, that preachers are now expected to be MAGA. They're expected not just to preach the gospel of Jesus, they're expected to preach the gospel of MAGA as well. And if they're not, then hell, their congregation might leave. It's something the book talks about, is that preachers who basically made the choice and said, I'm not going to talk about politics up here. We're a church, and we're going to talk about the gospel of Jesus Christ. We're going to talk about the Bible. We're going to talk about how to be a better Christian. And we're not going to talk about, Donald Trump or Kamala Harris. And those churches had people leave. That they had a significant number of, like, a significant percentage of their congregation would just leave and go to the church down the road, where the pastor was more than happy to talk about how Democrats are evil and liberals are ruining the country. And we got to support, the president when Trump was president. We got to support, and this is from the pulpit. And that's what they wanted, And this is a problem. This is a real problem in the evangelical movement. I think it is one, but I'm not in that movement. But I think what makes the book so powerful is that Tim Alberta is fully in this movement, and he wants it to be better. He wants it to be an actually Christian version of itself, rather than being like MAGA flavored Christianity, so to speak. I thought this book was really, really eye-opening. I learned a lot about evangelical culture, about the history of the evangelical movement in America, about the battles that they're fighting today, and kind of the camps that they fall into. Like with any movement, like with any organization, there's not a single type of person who's an evangelical. There's different types, and there's different camps of people, and some of those camps are, fighting for control of their movement. Some of them don't like the other camps and want them kicked out of the movement, and all of that. It was really, really eye-opening. It was really written in a very empathetic way. And I cannot recommend it enough. I think it was the best book I read this year. The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory by Tim Alberta. That is every book I read this year. If you combine part 1 and part 2, I read about 30 books this year, less than I have in years past. Usually I get somewhere between 35 to 40. This year just did not quite reach that. I don't know, maybe it was an election year. And I've been blogging more than I ever have. So, over at Infinite Scroll. So maybe the reading and the writing took a backseat this year as the election was happening. But I do have a bunch that I'm looking forward to next year. I'm just going to run through some books that are on my list. I'm looking forward to reading All the Light We Cannot See by Anthony Doerr. That's a book I've got in my hand right now. I'm looking forward to that in the new year. I'm looking forward to several books with people that I know. There's books that I have from friends, from colleagues, from acquaintances that I potentially might read this year. Andrew Heaton, who's been on the podcast, wrote a book called Tribalism is Dumb, which, I agree with the title. I'll have to read it to see if the argument is good. Johan Norberg wrote a book called The Capitalist Manifesto. I may end up reading that this year. There's a book from Kevin J. Elliott called Democracy for Busy People. It's kind of a funny, interesting title. Alexandra Lefebvre, I don't know how to pronounce his last name. Alexandra Lefebvre wrote a book called Liberalism as a Way of Life. And this was sent to me. I may end up reading this one. My friend Daryl Fairweather wrote a book called Hate the Game. Hate the Game, Economic Cheat Codes for Life, Love, and Work. I think that comes out later this year. So I'm looking forward to that one. I'm also looking forward to some books in the abundance category. There's a book forthcoming from Mark Dunkelman, who is actually working with PPI. Mark Dunkelman has a book called Why Nothing Works, which is another kind of pro-abundance book about, like, how did the government actually get to this point? If the government has stifled stuff, and the progressive movement has fallen in love with process and paperwork, rather than actually getting things done, how did the progressive movement get to that point where they love paperwork more than they love actual progress? That's what Why Nothing Works is about. And I have an advanced copy of it. I'm actually about halfway through it now. I think the book comes out in February or March, and I'm very much looking forward to having Mark on the show. I'm looking forward to Abundance. There's just a book called Abundance coming out with Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein as the authors. Looking forward to hopefully getting them on the show. I think we should be able to get them on the show. What else do I have looking forward right now? There's books that I've been meaning to read for a long time. I've been meaning to read Tyler Cowen's Stubborn Attachments. I've been meaning to read Steven Pinker's book, Enlightenment Now. These are classics that are several years old at this point, but I've always meant to read them. And then, there's some science fiction that I've been trying to look forward to. I'm looking forward to Before They Are Hanged, which is the second book in the Blade Itself trilogy from Joe Abercrombie. I'm looking forward to reading some more Ted Chiang. He has a collection of short stories called Exhalation. So that's some of the forward-looking stuff that I'm doing. I probably won't end up getting to all these. I forever have like a list of 15 books I'm supposed to read, and it never goes down. You read some books, you knock some off the list, and you just get more on the list. So if I read half of the ones that I've just mentioned, I'll consider that a success. We're trying to hit half, I think. But I don't know. We'll keep reading. We'll keep seeing stuff. We'll keep having people on the podcast who've written interesting books. And I'm looking forward to 2025. I hope you are as well. Thank you for listening, everyone. I hope that this was an interesting episode, and we will catch you at the next one.